what we're going to do in the symposium, and then I'll tell you a little bit about why we're doing this after Emma's talk, and then I will stop speaking. So I'm Eric Mandelbaum. Everybody can hear me fine, I imagine. Good. So we're going to have three 30-minute talks with Liuba and then Benedict and then Barbara. And our speakers today, the reason why they're giving talks and not me is because they're more interesting. I hear 100% of my talks and very few of theirs. We have a social psychologist, a developmental psychologist, and a neuroscientist, all from very, very kind of different areas of cognitive science, coming together to look at a topic that you might at first glance think has little to do with one another. But the way I see it, they're all part of this similar project that Emma was talking about. And it's a project where, to use my colleague, or I don't know, former colleague, Michael Devitt's phrase, Michael used to refer to himself as a brutal Aussie. And so when he would put really terrible comments on a student's paper, he would say, well, I'm a brutal Aussie. And so now I'm going to be the brutal Aussie for the moment and say, when Michael was drawing a distinction between procedural knowledge before and declarative knowledge, that's the sort of thing that I think is the distinction that we really want to push hard on. That a lot of things that look like they're extremely stupid or low level or associative or merely procedural are in fact extremely complex and representational and computational and rational. And so let me give you some idea of what that is and how it connects to Emma's work, and then I'll stop talking. So in response to some of the Q&A, people were asking, well, do you really think that there's something about belief desire psychology here? And what I think is, for common sense psychology, there's two things we want. On the one hand, we want to know whether questions like, Benedict believes this room is filled with people, are literally true or not. And there are some people, say the Churchlands, that will say those sentences are just false. In the future, neuroscience will show us that the real truth is that there's no need for belief. That's just a shorthand for whatever neural garbage is going off. That's one explanation. And one thing that you might want to do is understand if those sentences are true or false. But a different thing you might want to do is see what are the critical states in cognitive science that cause behavior. And this is very different in some sense than that first thing. What I want to know is, do people actually act out of their behaviors when we have to explain their behavior in the normal way that we do from third-person psychology and cognitive science? And here I think those two questions actually come together. So on the one hand, what Emma was saying to start, that we all know that we're supposed to start at 10:45 and we figure out where this room is and we all coordinate, and it seems like magic if you don't have belief desire psychology. That's right. And on the other hand, that theory gets us very far, but not all the way. If I tell you that my parents were alcoholics, then you might infer that I'm an alcoholic, or you might infer that I'll never have alcohol. And both of those are totally reasonable inferences. Sorry to pick on me and my parents, they're not alcoholics. On the other hand, if I tell you that, I've just broke up with my girlfriend and it was really terrible, you might predict, oh my God, you're gonna really go right after that and always be following and seeing what she's doing, or you'll never speak to her again. And both inferences are licensed by folk psychology. And so what we want is a theory that both explains how we get here and we do things right, and also where folk psychology goes wrong. We want to get the actual grain of what the variance of behavior is that these states explain. And then to go to move this project from folk psychology to cognitive science would in part both vindicate what Emma was talking about, how we can have reasons be the sorts of things that underlie our actions, and do this further thing where we see actually in the science things like belief playing the role of a critical causal variable. And just to give you the idea, because in some of the back and forth with the final question before, we're like, do you really think beliefs are affecting people's behavior? Well, just to give you two ideas of where this might come up. Idea one, if you run a placebo study and you tell people, we're going to give half of you crack cocaine and the other half of you not crack cocaine, and nobody's getting any of that, you're just lying to people. Well, what you're trying to do is see what happens when they believe that they're getting the drug versus not getting the drug. And the critical causal variable here is just the belief. And it's interesting when you read some of these neuroscientific studies, because you'll see the more hardcore the science is, the less worried they are about using words like belief. Whereas the more we get to social psychology, the more it turns into saying attitudes. And you're like, what is an attitude? Well, don't worry about what that is. And then the other place you'll see this is, now to pick on social psychology a little more, is try to do any misattribution theory or any dissonance without having something like beliefs, and the theories don't really work. Am I blocking you? Okay. So just to give you the idea, when you want to see why effort justification works, in effort justification, right? So just imagine that you are the sort of person who is in year 8 of graduate school. So you've spent your whole life wasting away in graduate school and toiling away, and your reasonable inference should be, oh my God, philosophy is not worth it. Why is anybody doing this? But in fact, the more effort you put in, the more you infer that the thing you're doing is incredibly worthwhile. People who just skate through and do really well are like, it's a job. But people who have to really work at it change their attitudes. And they change their attitudes to think that, of course, this is super important. And this has nothing to do with academia. You see the same thing happening in things as boring as rushing fraternities or as horrifying as being in boot camp. Anything where you put more effort in, you change your attitude more. And now, if you want to try to understand how that works, we could just say, oh, it's just neurons in the void, and then high-five each other and go home. Or you could try to make models of what's happening. And the normal models for this are models where you have the following premises that people are going through in something like an unconscious syllogism. And the premises are, I put a lot of effort into X. I wouldn't have put a lot of effort into X if I didn't care about it, or else I'm an idiot. I'm no idiot. X must be pretty cool. And you raise your attitude towards X. And how can you tell this is what's happening? Well, one way of telling it is to separate out the people who think they're idiots from those who don't. When you take out those who think they're idiots, meaning the clinically depressed, what you see is effort justification doesn't work. And if you don't want to do it statewise and instead you want to modulate somebody in real time, you can change their self-esteem. And then by changing this self-esteem, you change how much the effort justification works. And so what we see is we have this very old theory that does like a lot of interesting work. And the critical causal variables in this theory are ones that are quantifying over the same good old states that we seem to be using in folk psychology. So the goal is to take these states that we're using and then ramify them in certain ways to make them more accurate to the states that we actually are using in cognitive science. That's the kind of first step, and then we can get really funky and see how much more in very low-level circuits or in behaviors that seem to be super boring, how computational and incredibly complex they are. And that's what our three speakers will be talking about in different ways. At the end of every talk, the talks will be 30 minutes. We'll allow for a clarificatory question or two while we're switching over. And then we're going to do all the questions at the end. And I'm just going to tell you this one story I had for why I've decided to do it. And then you can decide whether I'm an idiot or not. So I introduced Fred Dretsky to Hillary Putnam once, and I was really surprised that they had never met. They're both very old at this point and pretty famous. And you know, yeah, it's not like there's so many people in philosophy of mind or whatever, you know. So I said, Fred, how have you never met Hillary? And he said, I saw him give a talk in the 70s, and he said to everybody, and you know, this thing that really upset me. And I was like, oh, was it when he was in his Maoist phase? And he said, no. And I said, okay, well, what was he doing? He said, Hillary said, I'll take all of your questions at once, and then at the end I will respond to them all in one single monologue. And for some reason that really upset Fred. And so the challenge before you is to answer all the questions at once for everybody in one single monologue. Or we can just have a normal discussion amongst people. Anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liuba Papeo. Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Okay, so first I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially Eric for having me as part of this very important discussion today. So, man is by nature a social animal. I know this quote is quite cheap, coming from a non-philosopher talking to an audience of philosophers, but in cognitive neuroscience, this is less trivial than one may think. In fact, the quest for the cognitive and neural mechanisms explaining the human social nature is relatively young, younger than in other research fields, and that's definitely true for vision science. So vision science has been traditionally concerned with the perception of stimuli such as dots, lines, contrast, luminance, a low-level aspect of perception, until decades ago, vision scientists were faced with the reality that human vision and the human visual cortex holds a quite high-level representation of the world, such as representations of objects. Even more, one principal organization of perception is the distinction between animate and inanimate things. So here you see an illustration of the large-scale organization of the visual cortex in this colorful area here. So if we see how the visual cortex responds to object, what we find is this broad distinction between regions that are more informative for recognizing animate objects in pink here, and regions that are more informative for recognizing inanimate objects in green here. And then also there are some hotspots, like areas that are highlighted here in circles that are particularly important and specifically involved in processing stimuli such as faces, bodies, biological motion, stimuli that are important to recognize animate things, other animals. And they are typical of other animals, if not diagnostic of their appearance. So what is it generally thought is that this organization of the visual system is responding to the need, the behavior and the evolutionary importance of recognizing, discriminating animals, animate things from inanimate things in the visual world. So on this reasoning, the human natural habitat is not the animal kingdom, but the social world. So in the social world, relevant entities are not just animate things or animals, but are social beings. Thus, the human life and the very human nature requires more than the ability to distinguish animate from inanimate things. It requires the ability to distinguish social from non-social. So the question that I'm addressing today is, can vision do it? Can vision discriminate between social and non-social things? So I will provide an affirmative answer to this question, of course, by showing some behavioral and neural data showing that vision has its own way to represent and to encode social things through the representation of social relationships. And then I will conclude with a developmental hypothesis that is emerging from this data. Okay, so first of all, what is a social, or better, who is a social being? In various definitions, social beings are characterized by gregariousness, mutual influence, prosociality, adaptation to group living, alignment with others, need to belong to relationships and groups, need to share experience of attention and emotion, and perhaps other things. So leaving aside the distinctions, what these definitions, these characterizations have in common is the general idea that a social being is an agent that engages with another, whose body, attention, and or action is directed toward another. In other words, a social being is an agent in a social interaction. Now, in the visual world, this psychological feature of social engagement is often signaled by a visual relational property that I call facingness. Facingness is the spatial positioning that allows for the mutual perceptual accessibility of two or more individuals. And it's important because it favors a number of social behaviors such as gaze following, shared attention, mind reading, and because of that it's common to many physical and communicative exchanges. So the hypothesis that we made at the beginning of this research was that the recognition of social beings might be mediated by efficient encoding of visual relational features such as facingness. So in the first study, we asked whether we deploy attention differently depending on whether two individuals appear to be related by virtue of their spatial positioning face-to-face or they don't. So we created this kind of stimuli, and based on this stimuli, we created this kind of visual search arrays. So in visual search, subjects are asked to look for a specific target among a number of distractors. So in this case, they had to look for the only facing dyad among a number of non-facing dyads, or, in another condition, for the only non-facing dyad among a number of facing dyads. So, and the task was quite difficult because the arrays were flashed very rapidly, and then the subject just had to report whether they had seen the target at the right or left of the fixation cross. So what we found was that finding the facing target among the non-facing target was significantly more efficient, better, faster, more accurate than finding the only non-facing target among an array of facing targets. So in the visual search literature, this is called a visual search asymmetry that suggests that the facing dyad has something more, something that makes it more salient to visual attention than visually matched non-facing dyads. So this is a long line of research. I have one of the authors here in the audience who was my former PhD student, so feel free to reach him later to know everything about this research if you are interested in. But the bottom line of this line of research is that this was the first demonstration that beyond the locations, features, and objects, visual search has rapid access to the relations between objects, in this case between people, and uses that information to give priority to face-to-face seemingly interacting individuals. Now, in the next study, we ask whether facing dyads not only are more likely to attract attention, but they are also processed more efficiently than non-facing dyads. Now, the gold standard of visual efficiency is face perception. We detect, recognize, identify faces better than any other familiar object in the environment. And this is because when we see a face, that's the theory, we access all the parts at once as a single object, skipping the part-by-part analysis that is typically implemented for other objects. And so this is the typical performance in any face perception task. Subject normally perform significantly better than in the perception of other familiar objects. But this advantage has a price, has a cost, which is that if we disrupt the typical spatial structure of a face with the eyes above the nose, above the mouth, by inverting the face upside down, we see a huge cost in performance, which is disproportionately larger than what we see for any other familiar object. And this is known as the face inversion effect. We find a similar effect when we test bodies. So now this is a very long line of research, and very rich and complex in some ways, but for the sake of this talk, just retain that the inversion effect tends to be the highest for stimuli that are processed particularly efficiently in visual perception. And it's the highest for faces and bodies relative to other objects. So we can take this effect as a signature of the visual sensitivity, how much vision likes, if you want, a given stimulus. So given our hypothesis that facing dyads are somehow special to vision, we design a paradigm to measure the inversion effect for this kind of stimuli. So in this paradigm, we presented facing and non-facing dyads, upright or inverted, because we wanted to measure the inversion effect, so to have this measure of visual sensitivity interleaved with other type of stimuli, facing, in this case, facing and non-facing chairs, upright or inverted, and plants. And this is how the task looked like. Stimuli were flashed very rapidly and then masked. This is a paradigm that is typically used to sort of, isolate the early stages of visual perception. And the subject had to perform a basic level categorization task. They just had to report whether they had seen bodies, chairs, or plants in each trial without any mention of the number of items, the orientation, the direction, facing, non-facing, upright, or inverted. Just a basic level categorization task. And what we found here is that subjects were, they were guessing because they felt like they were guessing, but in fact they performed quite well. But they performed reliably better when in recognizing and detecting facing dyads relative to the very same bodies presented back to back. Moreover, we found that the inversion effect was significantly larger for facing dyads relative to non-facing dyads. And this pattern is reminiscent of what we typically see when we compare the performance of faces with other objects. Now, this phenomenon emerges because the paradigm was designed in this way. This phenomenon seems to occur very rapidly. It's automatic in the sense that subjects don't seem to be aware of what's going on. At the end of the experiment, this effect has been replicated now a lot of times in different labs. And at the end of the experiment, we asked the subject whether they have noticed anything particular about the stimuli, the task, and they almost never report the facing, non-facing manipulation, interaction on interaction. They talk about, bodies, chairs, upright, inverted. That's pretty impressive, but they don't seem to be explicitly aware of this facing, non-facing manipulation, and yet this is what's driving their performance. So, is this a visual phenomenon? These are sort of, indications that this may be happening in vision, but we went down this pathway and decided to look into the brain. So in this first study, we recruit a new group of subjects, and we replicated, this is exactly the task that I showed you before, so they had to do the basic level categorization task, and we replicated the two-body inversion effect, which is this larger inversion effect for facing than for non-facing dyads. Then the subjects were called back for a second visit, and they repeated the same task. We wanted to see whether the effect was reliable, and we found a very high test-retest reliability, suggesting that this phenomenon is stable over time and easy to replicate in individual subjects. Then they came back for a third visit in which they took part in an fMRI study. So they were just lying in this fMRI scanner, and we measured their neural activity in response to facing and non-facing upright and inverted stimuli. There was no task here. They were just lying in the scanner, and we wanted to see basically where in the brain this behavioral, like the activity in the brain, where the activity in the brain could best predict this behavioral pattern. So how we did it, so for each voxel across the brain that responded to bodies relative more than to the baseline, we computed the neural to-body inversion effect. It's exactly the same thing, but in terms of neural activity. So we computed the neural activity for facing upright minus inverted bodies, minus the activity for non-facing upright minus inverted bodies. And then we ran a correlation between this value in each voxel and the behavioral effect for a given individual. And what we found was that across the whole brain, the effect was predicted by this activity here, which is the visual cortex, and is particularly a part of the visual cortex that has been known for decades to be particularly involved in the processing of body parts, such as the extrastriate body area. We get a similar effect, actually the same effect, which tends to be strongly left lateralized when we just run a simple contrast. So when we compare the activity in response to facing dyads minus the activity in response to non-facing dyads. And this is interesting because it's suggesting that these regions are not just discriminating between different configurations of bodies, but they are responding more to one specific configuration, which is the facing dyad, suggesting that they may be capturing some emergent property of the facing dyads or some integrated structure that results from this specific spatial positioning of the body. There might be seeing more than just two bodies. So in this study, we did another analysis in which we ask how single bodies are represented depending on whether they appear in a facing or in a non-facing dyad. And to test this, we basically recorded the activity in response to each single body posture, and then we trained a linear classifier to discriminate between the unique patterns associated to each body, unique activity patterns associated with each body posture. And then we trained the classifier to discriminate this individual body posture when it appears in a facing dyad or when it appears in a non-facing dyad. And what we found was that selectively in the EBA, in this region that keeps coming up in our experiments, the accuracy, the discrimination accuracy was significantly higher for the bodies seen in a facing dyad than for the very same bodies but seen in a non-facing dyad. Now, there is nothing in the stimuli from a vision science viewpoint, there is nothing in the stimuli that really motivates this effect. These are exactly the same classes of objects, the same body postures, the same number of pixels. Everything is the same except for the spatial positioning, which suggests that what we are seeing here is the distinction between the representation of an individual that looks socially engaged and the representation of an individual that doesn't look to be socially engaged. So this social, non-social visual distinction reveals our capacity to see meaningful relations between objects in addition to objects, features, and location. Okay, but these are not social relations, these are just social interactions, these are just two bodies face-to-face or back-to-back. So that's right. So we decided to make our stimuli a little bit more complex, and so we had these point light displays, animations of individuals interacting in a meaningful way, like this is a meaningful interaction, has been empirically tested, and like we are very good at sort of, interpreting this kind of stimuli, understanding that these are two people, what they are doing, and so on. And we contrasted the response, the neural response to these meaningful, fully fledged social interactions with the neural response to, perceiving just two individuals acting independently. And in fact, what we see is much broader network. You see all this activity going on from these posterior regions to the anterior regions, particularly in the right hemisphere, and some activity also in the left hemisphere. So in this study, we compare this response to the response to stimuli that were manipulated to isolate just the visual structure of the social interaction. Here, there is no meaning anymore. There is nothing meaningful going on anymore. These are just two bodies moving and facing toward each other, and everything else is matched, the distance, optical flow, and everything. And in fact, what we see is much lower activity in the regions that have been associated with, the representation of social and semantic properties of the social interaction, but we still find that there is a selective cluster here in this posterior left lateralized area that is suggesting that, so the hypothesis that this region, what we have identified here is a region of the visual brain that extracts and encodes visual relational information. So a region where the representation of social relationships begin to emerge based on the mere physical structure of the input, based on signals such as proximity, orientation, perhaps other signals such as synchrony, coordination, and so on. Now, this suggests an intriguing hypothesis for the development of these mechanisms. And that's the last part and the last point that I want to make. The ability to understand the social relationships manifests in the second year of life, toward the second, third year of life, when infants show the ability to evaluate and have a rich representation, make inferences about dominance, prosociality, affiliation, intimacy. And there is now a new BBS paper by Ashley Thomas that is coming up, and it's a very beautiful overview of these infants and toddlers' understanding of social interactions and social relationships in general. However, much earlier, in the first months of life, infants can already hold a quite rich representation of social interactions. For instance, in a study that we published a few months ago, we show that infants can assign, when they are exposed to visual events, they can sort of understand who is the patient and who is the patient, and they assign the two participants in the event to abstract category of agented patients, then can generalize across different events. And they do it, this is how we designed the study, just based on the postures, the body postures and spatial orientations of the bodies. So, but we don't know how, what are the neural mechanisms that support these early abilities that infants have to begin to represent social interactions. But we now have an hypothesis that is that the early stages of social interaction perception might rely on this posterior set of neurons that encode visual relational information in the stimulus structure. So to test this, we presented the same stimuli that I showed you before, these point-light displays of facing interacting people versus non-interacting people, and we used the functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which is a neuroimaging methodology to record the neural activities, and it's particularly useful to test infants because it's less discomfortable than fMRI. Like infants don't need to, you don't need to put a baby in the scanner, and they don't need to stay still. In fact, this method is very tolerant to motion, so it's great to test very young infants. But of course, we lose a lot in terms of spatial resolution relative to fMRI. So we first tested a group of adults to see whether we could sort of find the same activity with FNIS that we see with fMRI, and the response is yes. You see here this middle occipital and superior temporal activity that we also saw with fMRI. Now, we find a very similar network in 10-month-olds. So you see here that this posterior activity is still present. And even more interestingly, when we test 6-month-olds, we still, like we already find the network that is lighting up, starting with this left lateralized patch in the posterior part of the brain. So these results encourage the thinking that there is a mechanism where the represented, I would like to say bottom-up mechanism, I don't know whether it's the right characterization, but there is this mechanism where the representation of social interactions are formed in visual perception areas built upon the encoding of visual spatial cues. It put in other terms, if this left lateralized effect reveals the neural structure that support our capacity for structured perception, for perceiving the visual environment in a structured way, then infants before language have this capacity. If you're interested in more evolutionary aspect of this work, we have some studies with newly hatched chicks, so feel free to ask me later or just look at the paper that has been published. And I'm done, yeah. So let me just get to some discussion point. So this research is showing that the existence of perceptual cue-based mechanisms to detect social beings. That means that the vision encodes relational properties of the objects, such as facingness, proximity, posture, perhaps synchrony, coordination, perhaps the list is longer than that, which define the relations and the roles that individuals play in the relations. In addition to all the visual features that we know that are encoded to recognize the specific object, to recognize the individuals. Also, an interesting aspect of this research is that it's revealing so far uncharted representational classes in the visual cortex for encoding visual relational information. There is now debate whether there is a full pathway in vision in the visual cortex that is dedicated to this kind of processes, and this is sort of inviting also a reconsideration of the textbook knowledge about the bipartite organization of the visual cortex in a pathway for object recognition and a pathway for object location. Maybe there is more than that. Okay, it's happening in vision, so what? I guess that, my message today, and that's, then I'm more interested in listening what you have to say about this research. But, what is, these results are suggesting is that beyond shapes and space and spatial arrangements are originally, argued by Marr, human vision can see meaningful relations or interaction, or maybe the possibilities of relations and interactions. And therefore, there is a function for vision in thinking, or at least in beginning to unraveling the causal and structural, social structure of the visual world. And there are, of course, a lot of questions concerning the implication of this mechanism for explaining the actual behavioral choices that we make, going back to Emma's talk before, and, of course, what's the implication for the format of representations. These are all open questions that I hope we can also address today. And I stop here and thank you for the attention. Yeah, no, we find this effect specifically with people, with bodies, actually. We have tests, of course, in all these experiments. We have control conditions with other categories of object, and we don't see the same effects.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be here, and maybe I'll come down here because I don't really like that arrangement. Thank you so much for organizing this, Eric. This has been incredibly interesting and will continue to be very interesting, I'm sure, and this is some of my favorite type of stuff that we can do together to draw these connections across areas that are sort of seemingly unrelated. My name is Benedict Curdy. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, and the most important professional responsibility that I have is that I direct the social cognition lab there, which looks slightly different now. This picture is a little obsolete, but what we do is exactly the same as we did last year, which is to try to understand how people reason about, evaluate, relate to other people, both as individuals and as members of social categories. And to translate this into sort of simple questions, we ask, how do people know that certain old white guys are safe to affiliate with, whereas others are gonna try to screw them over? How do people decide which sports team to support and which sports team to treat with the appropriate disdain? And then, of course, I mentioned social categories. How do we decide whether to hire the senior candidate or the junior candidate for a job? This is an example from a time when there were still academic jobs in the United States. And the answer in social psychology to all of these questions is that this has to do with our attitudes. A note on terminology: social psychologists mean something very different here than philosophers do. This is simply evaluative information associated with some kind of social target. The idea being that if I like someone, I approach, I affiliate, I engage, and if I dislike someone, I stay away, I disengage, I avoid. And of course, this field is really, really vast. Within this field, I tend to focus on measures like this because they give us some indication of the relatively more automatic processes that happen in social evaluation. We refer to these normally as implicit attitudes, right? This is evaluative information that comes to mind spontaneously when we encounter social targets unintentionally, maybe even uncontrollably. And the lab has sort of a dual focus. One of them is a very clear sort of cognitive question of how these attitudes come about, how they are represented, and how they change once they are in place. And we are a social cognition lab because we also care sometimes about what this means and implies for social group-based inequality. Not gonna talk about that today at all. Today it's gonna be really the cognitive science of implicit attitudes. And within this, often we focus on this question of formation and change, not only because it's interesting for translational issues, but also and primarily because it reveals something about the very basic cognitive nature of the phenomenon that we are studying. And when it comes to this question of how implicit attitudes form and change, and this is where this comes back very directly to your talk, Emma, when I came to grad school now over 10 years ago, this was really the only game in town that people took seriously, that these things form and change in ways that are associative. And I'm gonna come back a little bit to what this means, but the sort of ideal typical example of this is evaluative conditioning. We take non-words like these ones as stand-ins for the real social categories that we care about, and then we pair them repeatedly with intrinsically positive stimuli like this one, or intrinsically negative stimuli like these ones. And then slowly, over time, these associative representations that we have in the mind catch up with the associative structure out there in the world. And importantly, to come back to the nomenclature that was used before, this is supposed to be sort of irrational, not responding to people's beliefs and desires. And this was really boring because this was the one view, and so no one really did studies on formation and change because this was just assumed to be accurate. And then a man by the name of Jan de Houwer came along and showed something incredibly interesting, and this was a paper that I read in first month of graduate school and sort of set me on a path that was completely different than what I had envisioned, because Jan had this paper from 2006 where he showed that it's enough to give people the verbal instructions that X will be paired with good and Y will be paired with bad, and that you got an effect of this on implicit attitudes. And this is very weird. This was very unexpected from my perspective. I wanted to replicate it immediately because I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because this is a very, very different way of forming an attitude than this one here that is based on hundreds, if not millions, of exposures to stimuli. This is something very specific to humans, one-shot symbolic propositional learning, which we know we do, but the new idea was this affects these things that were supposed to be in this completely separate encapsulated implicit system. Of course, this is not new, and I'm not going to go through the philosophy of this because there are actual philosophers in the room. But of course, this distinction is not new at all, and you can trace it back to ancient philosophy, but also in psychology, it appears and reappears, these associative ideas in learning and memory and development. And what's really interesting is that every single time these ideas appear, then we have a counter idea that also appears, which is these associative structures are not enough to capture the richness of human thought, and that's Eric's paper that he's trying to read backwards now against Alief. And this should come up one by one. So one conceptual distinction that I would really try to make before I get to the actual data is what exactly do we mean by an attitude to be associative or propositional? And we can think about this across multiple levels of analysis. The first, the simplest one, is if you think about it at the level of experimental procedures. What is the procedure that the subject experienced? Is it a relatively more associative thing like evaluative conditioning, or a relatively more propositional sort of procedure like a verbal message, right? This is sort of a base level distinction, but it's not going to get us exactly where we want to go for multiple reasons. One of them is language has co-occurrences embedded in it. So that's one problem. The other problem is the fact that you saw pairings of stimuli doesn't mean that you didn't make inferences, right? You might reason about those pairings that you saw. And so another question that you can ask, which is I think a little bit more interesting psychologically, is what are the processes, what are the transitions between mental states that give rise to whatever representation that gets created at the end that really drives responding on these measures. And this question is really complicated. I'm so envious of areas that can actually test these because the mental operations are more restricted. I don't know how to answer this, and I'm not going to come to this today at all, but I will come to number one and then number two. So let's get to the actual data. This will be the first ever study that I did in graduate school. I've been doing this a long time, and this is work that I did with my advisor, Mahzarin Banaji. And we asked a very simple question, which is, at this time, it had already been shown that these associative procedures like evaluative conditioning work to some degree, and that these more propositional types of interventions like descriptions of an EC procedure can also work in shifting implicit attitudes. But there were these two camps, and the associative people were doing their associative studies, and the propositional people were doing their propositional studies. So the very simple idea was, let's put this into one study and look at the relative effectiveness of these two. Very simple, and this is always sort of the structure of the studies that I'm going to show to you today. Some exposure to information, and then a test of implicit attitudes. So the particular design in the learning phase, we assign participants to one of four between participant conditions. Control is just a baseline measure, and then the three conditions of interest, these pairings that I talked about, repeatedly pairing these novel groups, members of novel groups with either positive or negative images with one-on-one mapping, members of one group always paired with positive images, members of the other group always paired with negative images. And again, under the associative view, this is the procedure that should really shift implicit attitudes because implicit attitudes are assumed to be associative. And then the Jan de Houwer manipulation that I found so striking on day 2 of graduate school, which is simply describing this procedure to the participants, importantly without any actual exposure. They didn't see any pairings. The only way of inducing the attitude here was by them reading this verbal message that describes the procedure. And then in the combined condition, we put these two together to see if there are effects individually, what do the combined effects look like? And so here, first we describe the procedure to participants, and then unlike in the pure statements condition, they also experience the pairings at the end. So I've been promising data, no, still no data, and then they took a very standard implicit association test, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Stimuli are coming up on the screen. Importantly, people are not told to evaluate, they're categorizing. And from that behavior, we can infer what types of evaluative information may come to mind unintentionally as they are doing this task. Data, almost there. So on the x-axis, I'm showing the 3 conditions of interest, pairing, statements, and combined, not showing the control condition separately because I'm representing that as 0 here. And then on the y-axis, higher values mean more learning in line with whatever manipulation participants experienced in that particular condition. And we got 3 really surprising data points, so much so that I had to really go back and double check and triple check. I remember this, that the conditions are labeled accurately. We also replicated this 5 or 6 times before we were able to publish it because we both believed it to be true. So the first surprising data point, the manipulation that was supposed to really do a lot of the work here, because it was supposed to be creating this match between the learning modality and the outcome, didn't produce a significant effect, and the effect was really small. When we put all the studies together from thousands of participants, it becomes significant, but it's still substantively really small. And this is very surprising from an associative perspective because this was supposed to be the procedure that creates much more learning than the statements condition, where not only do we get a significant effect, the effect is 3 times as large as the effect in the pairings condition, again on a measure that is supposed to be particularly sensitive to this type of thing and not particularly sensitive, or maybe not at all sensitive to this type of thing. And then the third surprising data point, which we also replicated over and over again, these 2 conditions are statistically equivalent to each other, which means that me simply telling you what's going to happen produces just as much learning as me telling you and then you actually having the experience with the procedure. Again, very interesting, and maybe points in a direction that although these procedures look very different from each other, they might rely on some sort of shared mechanism. And again, of course, we didn't believe this, so we replicated it again and again and again, and even with pre-existing categories, you can get this effect, which is kind of interesting. So, and these are some of the strongest pre-existing attitudes that you can find in American samples, and you see the same effect emerge that you have seen before, which is really weak effect of associations, really strong effect of propositions. The 2 of them seem to be redundant with each other, which is also pretty counterintuitive. Generalizes, it also generalizes to race, by the way, which we have shown in another paper since then. My colleague Tessa Charlesworth did a replication in children. Not only does the effect replicate there, it's even stronger. The kids show an effect only in response to the verbal message, and not at all in response to the evaluative conditioning. So if anything, it's even stronger than it is in the adults, and it seems to be more generally true in the field as well, not just specific to our lab. But one thing that really remains very unclear based on these initial results, and this is sort of based on this idea that language has co-occurrence structure, is what exactly about language is doing the work here. Maybe it's just that Niphians and good and Lapians and bad are co-occurring in the same message. For some reason, that's more effective than those co-occurrences. And so we wanted to know what exactly is it about language that's doing the work here, and whether we can provide evidence not only for these inputs, that this is a linguistic input, but that there are actual inferential transitions that are playing a role in the formation of implicit attitudes. And I did these studies with my friend Yarrow Dunham at Yale. This is a very cool picture, actually. Yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Right? So the idea is this. I can have a statement like this, Poland is beautiful, and it includes a co-occurrence of Poland with beautiful, and under the associative view, that's what matters. But then, and now I'm using the word attitude in the philosophy sense, we can attach different propositional attitudes to this, right? I can say, I hope that, I doubt that, or even, I really don't think that. And then the question is, if I attach something like this to this statement, the co-occurrence structure is exactly the same, but the inference should be very different. So the question is, when we have a situation like this, what do participants do? And do the inferences that they make influence the way that they form implicit attitudes? So the case that we used was not really Poland is beautiful, it was something slightly different, which is a conditional statement of this kind. If you see a green triangle, certain stimulus, then you can conclude something negative about this novel target. And then we do this nasty trick of showing a disambiguating stimulus that actually does not appear in the conditional statement. And as Emma mentioned, people do one of two things. Either they have taken Logic 101 and they know that there's nothing to be concluded here because it's uninformative, or this is a good chunk of participants as well, about 50-50 will infer the opposite of what's included in that statement. This is a normative mistake known as denying the antecedent. And so what we can do is everyone undergoes this type of learning phase, and then we collect this measure of whether people make the inferential mistake or not in response to a combination of a conditional statement like this and a stimulus like this, and then we see whether those two groups of participants differ in the way that they form implicit attitudes in response to the very same stimuli, right? So it's very hard to come up with any low-level associative explanation here because everyone sees exactly the same stuff. The inferences that they make from the same stuff are different. So what do we do here? Well, we have the control condition, which is sort of boring, just baseline. But then the question is, when we're subdividing participants from the experimental condition into participants who reason accurately versus participants who make the error, what do we see in terms of their formation of implicit attitudes? And as a propositional perspective would predict, people who reason accurately do no updating whatsoever, which is kind of interesting and kind of difficult to explain in associative terms, because if it's just associations out there in the world automatically entering my mind, why are they not entering it? Well, presumably because I made some inference here that they are not relevant. And then, of course, the million-dollar question is, people who make the mistake update in line with that mistake. And so you can calculate all types of base vectors to show that this is very much in line with a propositional perspective and very, very difficult to reconcile with an associative perspective, because under that perspective, everyone should look identical and everyone should be in the negative domain. And so this is, I think, pretty compelling evidence to show that it's not only the verbal message that matters, but really the inferences that participants make from it. But there are two issues with this study. One of them is that this result is based on an individual difference, right? So it is possible that that mistake that participants make in reasoning is correlated with other stuff, and it's really that other stuff that's causing the differences across groups, and not that individual difference that we think is of consequence. And also this is confined to conditionals maybe, although I don't know why it would be. So this leads me very directly to project 3, which is InPress in OpenMind with Eric, who also has a cool picture, actually, not just Yaro, and also Yaro. And so here we're conceptualizing and attacking this problem slightly differently to get away from the individual difference type of design. And specifically what we do is we are relying on this interesting, I don't know if this is a continuum or two natural kinds of adjectives, but they're adjectives like these ones, and you can see the positive ones on top and the negative ones on the bottom. And an exercise that you can do very quickly is try to come up with antonyms for these, and if you're like 99% of our participants in these studies, you can do that very, very easily. You can generate antonyms very, very quickly for these. And then you can contrast that with this other set of adjectives that are equally positive and equally negative, where people are really struggling to come up with something that's the exact opposite in meaning. And so as a shorthand, I will refer to the ones on the left as bipolar adjectives and the ones on the right as unipolar adjectives. And here what we're asking is there not only whether implicit attitudes are sensitive to negation, but whether they are more sensitive to the negation of bipolar adjectives, which are easy to negate, than to the negation of unipolar adjectives, which are difficult to negate. That type of distinction, I think, would be incredibly difficult to explain without making reference to these inferential mental states. we did a very long process of validation, which I'm not going to go into, to make sure that those adjectives differed in the ways that we wanted and not in ways that we didn't want. And then it's essentially a 2x2 design where there is a bipolar condition and a unipolar condition. In both of those conditions, participants learn about two targets. One target is characterized exclusively by positive adjectives, the other one exclusively by negative adjectives. Except in the bipolar case, it's all bipolar adjectives. In the unipolar case, it's always unipolar adjectives. And so our baseline condition is an affirm condition, right, where we just see whether there are differences in the valence of these adjectives, which is important for us to have a good baseline for this test. And then what's of actual theoretical interest is what happens if we start negating those adjectives. First of all, do we see an effect of negation or not? And then if we do we see a larger effect of negation for bipolar adjectives that are easy to negate than for unipolar adjectives that are difficult to negate? So let me come to the data. Last set of data that I will show you today. Affirm condition on the left, negate condition on the right, and the sort of initial finding, which we were very happy to see. Well, we have a significant interaction, which is always good. But importantly, in the affirm condition, there is no difference in the valence of the adjectives, right? So if we see any difference in the negation condition, that has to come from something other than valence. And so what do we see when we start negating these adjectives? Two things. One of them is you can see both in the bipolar and the unipolar case, you can see very clear movement from the affirm condition to the negate condition, which means that the negation operator that's included in those sentences plays a role. Again, kind of difficult to reconcile with a purely associative story because the co-occurrence structure is exactly the same. But then also you can look at this difference between the bipolar and the unipolar condition. In the bipolar condition, we see full reversal into negative territory. In the unipolar condition, it's hovering around neutrality. And again, the idea is that these are easy to negate and these are more difficult to negate. And that's not surprising. The surprising finding is that this distinction finds its way not only into our explicit attitudes, but also in our implicit attitudes that are measured more automatically. This is kind of the end of the empirical data, and we show this over and over again with multiple sets of stimuli, with multiple measures, just to make sure that it was not specific to this setup that I showed you earlier. And again, I think this is really compelling evidence to show that a purely associative story is not going to be able to capture what's going on. And so a few relatively general points at the end, and then I'll sit down and shut up. The first one being that there is now a lot of evidence to suggest that implicit attitudes are sensitive to verbal messages, right? But that finding in and of itself is kind of ambiguous because words are co-occurring in language, and so you need more evidence to show that they're also sensitive to these inferential transitions. And I've showed you two pieces of evidence here. Another piece of evidence that's very different, which I didn't have time to show today, it doesn't even have to come from language. You can show participants displays that depict causal relationships. They pick out what's causal and what's non-causal without any verbal description, and that distinction also goes into implicit attitude. Specifically, a stimulus that's causally responsible for something good is going to be more implicitly positive than a stimulus that's only associated with the same good thing but not causally responsible for it. The other side of the coin, which I also didn't show today, but you should really look into the work of my colleague Tal Moran. She did wonderful work on this, which is on the explicit side of things, which are assumed to be fully propositional. She shows over and over again that these associative transitions between mental states influence explicit attitudes as well. So not only are implicit attitudes sensitive to propositional transitions, explicit attitudes are also sensitive to these more associative transitions between mental states. And then the three questions at the end, and then I'll really sit down. The first one is, I didn't say anything about how these are represented in the mind. And I think that's an incredibly tricky question. I think what we can say is, whatever the representation is sensitive somehow to propositions. Jan de Houwer likes to say that this shows that the representations are propositional. I'm not at all on board with that claim. I think we would have to show way more to be able to make that claim. If these two sets of attitudes respond to exactly the same types of information in exactly the same way, why do they become dissociated so often? And why do we even need implicit attitudes if they show exactly the same thing as explicit attitudes do? I have an answer to this, but I'll leave it to the Q&A if anyone cares. And then the last thing that I wanted to also say is, really shockingly, when we did this meta-analysis, we found that people are studying this only in Loppians and Niffians and green squares and blue circles. And so there's a very big question of what happens when these are well-established attitudes toward race, sexual orientation, ethnicity. Probably very, very different. And we don't really have a clue because no one has done the work to say how exactly it is different. I just wanted to highlight my amazing collaborators again on this line of work. The learning part was one thing, but getting to work with these three people has really been a highlight of my career. And thank you so much for being here. We use multiple different measures, the IET being one of them, which is this dual categorization task, but you can show the same effects with sequential priming. You can show the same effect with the affect misattribution procedure, so all the standard ways of measuring implicit attitudes are showing these types of inferential effects to slightly different degrees, but it is not specific to a particular way of measurement. All of these measures, what they share in common is this indirect measurement idea. I don't ask you to directly evaluate the stimulus. I don't ask you to report those evaluations. I just ask you to perform some behavior, and from your performance on the task, I'm making an indirect inference about whatever your spontaneous evaluation might be. Well, because I think that to show something about the format of the representation, you would have to show way more than what we're showing here, right? So one very simple alternative is that you do get some sort of summary score, and Emma, you alluded to this, right? There are way more complicated associative theories than the ones that are saying every single time you pair two things with each other, they will become more associated, right? You could imagine that you get some sort of associative-like representation, like a scalar value at the end, that's sensitive to truth, that's sensitive to relational information, right? It's not based on brute force co-occurrences, but something that is a very compressed representation, for example, and doesn't include all the details of the learning history. So in that sense, it may not be a propositional representation, it may not have a truth value, it may not even have anything that could be negated even in principle, because it might be just a scalar value, but a scalar value informed not only by how many co-occurrences you experienced and with what, but really the way that you reasoned in the past. But that all of that episodic detail and all the details of those inferences may get lost, especially over time.
Okay, so while we wait for this to go on, I'll just tell you a little bit about our last speaker. My mom's maiden name is Warshawski, so you'd think I'd be able to pronounce Barbara's last name, but that is the wrong idea. So I'm going to try to correctly pronounce her name and then butcher it. I would say it's Barbara Pomashowska, but that is not correct. Sorry? Pomichovska. And Barbara's coming to us from Birmingham and is a hometown speaker, so bringing us home. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you for the introduction, Eric. It's great to being here. Thanks for the organizers, and thanks to Eric for putting together this amazing symposium. It's been great to hear your talks, guys. And I'm a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm going to talk about babies, and more specifically, I'm going to talk about the building blocks of human thought that we can observe in human babies. And to start, I'll take you on a quick trip back in time. So when we, not such a long time ago, about 15, maybe 17,000 years ago, humans have a handful of tools at their disposal, but it was a really limited, small set of tools that we've been going by back then. Today, we have thousands of tools, cultural artifacts, all sorts of things. And these keep coming every day. So we are an incredibly productive species, productive, creative species. When we look at our species that exist on the planet along us, well, we realize that they do create some things, but nowhere nearly as much as we do, and nowhere nearly as complex as we do. And what I would like to reflect on today is, what are the origins of human cognitive productivity? Where does it come from? And of course, I won't be able to give you one simple answer. It's a complex process, but I would like to especially highlight one cognitive mechanism that I think plays a critical role in human cognitive productivity, and it's combinatorial thought. You may know also in the literature nowadays, compositionality, and it's the ability to combine symbols, simple elements, into complex, structured, and meaningful outcomes. So basically the ability to use symbolic representation to build models of the world and then extend these models productively in completely brand new things. And one sort of most intuitive example of combinatorial thought is natural language, where we take concepts and code them into words, linguistic symbols, and then subject them to grammatical rules to create complex utterances. Despite its seeming simplicity, this process is actually very complex. It's effortless for us to extract meaning from a sentence, but it takes complex syntactic, logical, semantic, and conceptual computations that I'm not going to go into it. But just to say that something that on the surface is effortless, it comes for free to an adult human, it actually hides a huge cognitive complexity underneath. And combinatorial thought by no means is unique to language. It actually permeates virtually any domains of human activity if we start thinking about it. And just to give you a couple of examples, combinatorial thought is involved in play and mathematics in dance. And if you start looking around, you'll find dozens and dozens of other examples. So a really fundamental cognitive process. And what I would like to ask today is, before that actually, just to show, so in the, well, we're surrounded by generative AI, and some people may be thinking, oh, symbols, compositionality, that's sort of old school, who cares about it nowadays? But in fact, it's sort of leaving a renaissance today. So there's a huge literature. These are just a couple of examples going back, looking at compositionality, combinatorial. I've just muted myself. Program induction, and showing that these are really, really basic, fundamental ways of speeding up learning, of building models that are generalizable and can learn from poor quality data. And what I would like to do today is ask, what are the ontogenetic origins of human cognitive productivity? So where does this complex ability come from? And I would like to consider two alternatives. One possibility is the cognitive tools that enable combinatorial thought, namely symbols and compositionality, are part of an early cognitive toolkit that we are endowed with and that can manifest very early in life in some simple forms. Another alternative, which has sort of been historically more prevalent in developmental psychology and maybe still quite popular today, is that symbols in particular are something extremely hard for the human mind. It takes years to actually understand the symbolic nature of things, and it's not before 4 years of age that kids can actually appreciate what symbols are. So on that account, combinatorial thought would be something that emerges over developmental time as a result of learning and experience. And what I would like to do today is summarize your research program in 5 studies and 5 questions, in which I will try to argue that this first possibility may be what's actually the case. I will talk to you mostly about babies that are around 1 year of age, and will tell you about studies done using 2 main methodologies, eye tracking and EEG. So we'll proceed in 2 parts. I'll first talk about symbols and then about compositionality. And I'll consider whether infants can at all deploy symbolic representation. If they do they do it spontaneously? Does it come for free, or maybe it's very costly? And also, what kind of functions does symbolic representation have for them in addition to supporting communication, can they, for instance, use symbols to compress information? And then I will proceed to conventional thought, and I will ask whether infants can actually combine symbols into complex representations, and whether they can do this to actually understand complex noun phrases, complex utterances, and then I'll just point you to some nonverbal combinatorial processes that may be available out there. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So do infants actually have access to symbolic representations? Can they deploy symbols as they go around the world? And in order to answer these questions, I will use a study, namely word learning. So since 2010s, there's been a growing literature showing that already during the first year of life, already as early as 6 to 9 months of age, babies have developed a receptive vocabulary. So obviously they cannot talk, but they understand a handful of words. They have a vocabulary of simple common nouns, such as toys or objects or food items, and this vocabulary is rapidly growing. So it's now relatively well established. Not many people argue with that. Receptive vocabulary is in place very early on. But what people now argue about, what's the nature of these early words? Are these early words actually linguistic symbols? Do babies appreciate their symbolic referential nature? Or maybe these early words are nothing else than some sort of associations with objects with which they co-occurred. So for babies, the status of the words may be just pure sounds like any other sounds in the world that just got by the virtue of co-occurrence where specific objects or categories of objects were sort of glued and linked to them. And in order to answer this question, we've done an eye tracking study that came out from this sort of rationale. So if infants appreciate the symbolic nature of words, they should only link novel words with objects or with categories of objects following communicative actions, such as pointing, but not instrumental actions, such as grasping. And let me illustrate what I mean by this with a simple example. So if I were trying to teach you a Polish word, jabłko, it would be a good idea if you associate this object to which I'm pointing at while I'm uttering this word, because pointing is a communicative action with a local goal of reference disambiguation. So I do point specifically in order to disambiguate what I'm referring to. So you may safely assume that the word that accompanies my pointing should be linked with the object that is targeted by this action. If you see me grasping for an apple, and you hear a word jabłko, it may be not such a good idea to actually link these two things, because grasping is an instrumental action, and which local goal is to retrieve an object, to acquire an object. In the verbal symbols, the language that accompanies it may be completely orthogonal to the goal of my action. I could be as well grasping for a book or a flower or something else. So basically we put this idea into test in a word learning study using eye tracking. So we basically showed babies two novel objects that I have never seen before, and we would point to one of these objects and we would label it with a novel name. And we would contrast a pointing situation, so a communicative action. Let me just play it for you so that you can get a sense what the babies saw. So we would point to the object, and then we would bring the baby's attention to the middle and ask for that object. And now you'll see a condition where we point to the same object, to an object, label it, and we ask for the other object. So if babies, do you consider these words as referential symbols that should be linked with the objects that are targeted by the pointing actions? They should look at the object that was pointed when its name is repeated, and they should look to the other object when they hear a different name. And we contrasted the pointing situation, exactly the same stimuli, exactly the same words, exactly the same audio, with an instrumental action, namely grasping. And I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'll just play you a few seconds so that you see how the grasping looked like. and then you get the idea. So everything is the same besides the action that is targeting the object. And then just to recap our predictions, if the babies do consider words have for them a special symbolic status, they should be linking them with objects in the pointing condition, in the communicative action condition, but not in the instrumental action condition. And we assess that by asking babies once the hand left the object to look back either at the object that was previously labeled or the other one. And what do we see in the results? So basically what you will see here is time on an axis, x-axis, and on y-axis you will see baby's looking score. So everything that is positive means looking to the object that was targeted by the action, and everything that is negative means looking to the distractor. And in the pointing case, we see, just as we predicted, that after the babies were asked to look back at the labeled object, or they oriented to the object that was pointed at, and when they had the other name, they oriented to the other object. This effect was relatively short-lived, then they started looking to the baseline, but that's sort of a typical pattern of looking in the eye tracking experiments with babies. And now when we contrast this with grasping, what happened here that no matter what word they had, they would always stare at the object that was targeted at the action. So these results show that they basically appreciate the different nature of communicative and instrumental actions, and then what goes with that is that they have an expectation about the sound that accompany these actions, the words that accompany pointing actions, they consider that they are actually referential symbols, and they link them selectively to the objects that were pointed by communicative actions. And you may wonder that, oh, maybe something else was going on with pointing, like babies generally would stare longer at objects they were pointed at, but they wouldn't care about objects that were grasped, but that was not the case. So as you can see, when you take periods of the trial when there was no sound, they looked equally. They would look equally to the objects regardless of the action that they've seen. So basically, this experiment suggests that by 12 months of age, so by the end of the first year of life, infants treat words as symbols that may stand for something else, that may stand for objects. So with that in mind, we can now ask, how would they deploy symbols? Would they deploy symbols spontaneously as we do as adults? So basically for us, when I show you, for example, this object, it takes no effort. You probably immediately go and categorize this as bottle. Like, it's effortless for us to categorize items in the world in familiar circumstances. Would the babies do the same? And the case study that I would like to use to talk about this is mutual exclusivity. And mutual exclusivity is an effect that describes our tendency to associate novel words with unfamiliar objects. So if I show you these two things, and then I'll ask you to hand me the Moxie, you'll probably go for this thing here. And that's basically, some people would argue that you would do something like a reasoning through exclusion in the background. You would say, oh, Moxie must be either this guy here or that guy here. This guy is not a Moxie, therefore the Moxie must be here. Must be this other weird object that I don't have a name for. And mutual exclusivity effect emerges around 18 months of age. And why is that? Well, people argued, well, this is because infants cannot reason by exclusion beforehand. And there were some other schools of thought that suggested limitations in social cognition. I'm not going to go into that now, but essentially something complicated must be missing from the infant's mental toolkit that they cannot perform this kind of reasoning here. But there is a hidden assumption here, which is very obvious, and it's sort of funny to think that it's been overlooked for such a long time. In order to perform reasoning by exclusion here, what one has to do is one has to categorize this guy over here as a bear. So you need to represent it conceptually. You need to retrieve the linguistic symbol that is associated with the subjects. Otherwise, you cannot reason about the language that you hear. And our questions were, what if actually babies fail at this task at an earlier age because they cannot, they do not spontaneously retrieve symbols that they otherwise know for familiar objects? What if they need to be prompted to do so? And one way to prompt them to do that would be to frame the situation in a communicative signal, give them some communicative prompts in order to conceptualize the things that they are exposed for before the language comes. So typically, an mutual exclusivity study would look like this. You would see two objects in silence, and then you would ask about one of them. So the language, the communication would only come at this point. What we decide to do is to bring in nonverbal communication. So nothing, not to suggest babies any kinds of words, but just to prompt them to try to think conceptually, retrieve the symbol of the object that is being targeted by the nonverbal communication. So after a silent baseline, they would see a hand pointing always to the familiar object. And then we would ask either for the familiar object, where is the teddy, or for an unfamiliar object, for instance, where is the Moxie, which is here the cheese grater. And we would measure how baby's looking changes at test after the object was labeled relative to the silent baseline. And what we've seen, and this was with a group of British English learning babies, you will see babies' overall looking scores. Everything that is positive means looking at the familiar object. Things that are negative meaning looking at the unfamiliar object when we asked about the unfamiliar object. And what we see that when we ask for teddy, babies would indeed increase their looking at the teddy bear, indicating that they recognize the word. And when we ask for the Moxie, okay, you won't be able to see this one, but you can see here that when we ask for the Moxie, they would look longer to the novel and familiar object, showing that they can actually carry out the mutual exclusivity reference, suggesting that this pointing action occurring before labeling must have prompted them to retrieve the conceptual description in the symbol associated with the familiar object that they wouldn't have done otherwise until a few months later. These guys were 12-month-old. So we've seen this effect in British English, and we've seen it in Hungarian, so two very different linguistics from different languages from different language groups, and then we again replicated this effect on a larger sample of Hungarian babies. So it seems to be pretty robust, and it suggests that even though babies seem to be able to use symbolic representations, they may be using them somewhat differently than older children and than we adults do. So they might not be going around the world and trying to describe what they see in the concepts and symbolic representations that they are familiar with. They may need to be prompted in order to do so. And then one other thing that I would like to talk about is what other uses than communication symbolic representation may have for babies, and specifically what it would help them compress information. And the case study here will be working memory. So us as adults, it's quite a well-established finding in the working memory, also long-term in the memory literature overall. When we are asked to memorize the objects, we often use sort of category labels or category symbols rather than the specific object with all the details that we've seen. We of course can encode the details, but the category symbols seem to have a prominent role. So we asked what would be the representational format that infants would actually deploy when having to store objects in their working memory. Would they try to encode the object with all the featural details that it carries, or would they go for a symbol, for a placeholder, suppress this information in a symbol that they can keep in memory during the lay period? And if infants do that, if they go for symbols rather than object features, they should, and when we hide an object and then we show them a different object after the occlusion, they should be more sensitive to changes across categories of objects than to changes within categories of objects. And in order to test this question, we've designed a change detection task for babies. So you can see a baby wearing an EEG cup, and here are the stimuli that it sees. So you would have a stimuli coming up on the stage being covered by an occluder, and after the occlusion, they would either see exactly the same stimulus or a different stimulus of the same category, or yet a stimulus from a completely different category. And we would measure their brain responses to the object reappearance after occlusion. So I'm going to show you are the event-related potentials that we recorded when the screen started to go down, and which you can see that this interesting pattern that two of these lines sort of cover each other, one stands upward. And the interesting bit is that the lines that cover each other that are those corresponding to no change trials and within category change trials, suggesting that babies showed the same response to the trials with no change and the trials where within category changes occurred, noticing only the across category changes, which would suggest that basically what happened is that they retrieved the concept, the symbol that they could use to describe the object when it was presented, and what they held in memory was the symbols, in this case, for example, shoe, and which did not have enough detail to tell, to allow them then to tell the shoe that they saw after occlusion from the shoe that was presented to them before. In the control condition, what we showed babies, so we wanted to see that this is not something that they would spontaneously do, that may have nothing to do with symbols. We showed them objects that they were not familiar with, so they didn't have categories that they didn't have symbols for. And here you can notice that they were perfectly able to notice all sorts of changes. So when they did not have symbols to fall back on, they would actually go and make the effort of encoding the featural effects of the objects that they were shown. And one interesting thing in that study that I will mention very briefly is that we also looked at babies' strategies of encoding objects and of maintaining them during the occlusion. And you can see that basically there's way more red in the graphs over here than over here, and which basically shows that during encoding and maintenance and memory, babies who saw familiar objects had an increased gamma activity than babies who saw unfamiliar objects. So these differences in storing objects, so having symbols for objects that babies are being shown, affects also not only the retrieval strategies, but also encoding and maintenance strategies of stimuli that they were shown. And I'm gonna skip over this, but basically consistently we've seen this in other frequency bands. I'm very happy to chat about this if someone is interested. So basically it looks like babies do have symbolic representation. They don't necessarily deploy it spontaneously, but they do deploy it in communicative contexts, and they also use it to help their working memory. They use it to compress information. And the sort of last question that I have for today is, given that they have symbols, what kind of interesting things they would do with those symbols? Would they be able to combine those symbols together and perform compositionality? And the case study that I will talk about is understanding complex noun phrases. So again, using language. So when I would ask you, where is my pink elephant, and show you these guys to choose from, in order to be able to answer my question while reasoning, what you would probably do, you would have to retrieve the concept linked to the word pink. You will probably have to retrieve the concept linked to the word elephant, and then combine them together to get the referent. So basically understanding simple noun phrases is sort of the most fundamental case of compositionality and combinatorial thought. And our approach here was to, and you would say, all great, but if you were a developmental psychologist, you would sort of laugh at me saying like, yeah, babies do have nouns, but they don't necessarily have modifiers. So where will you get your complex noun phrases to throw at them? And indeed, we faced that problem. So what we did, we proceeded in 2 steps. And first, we taught babies words for 1 and 2 in experiment 1, and then we would present them with quantified noun phrases such as 2 ducks, for example, to see whether they can compose this newly learned quantity names with common nouns that they learned prior to the lab visit. And important note, this study was done in Hungarian, and Hungarian is a cool language for that, because when you glue a quantifier to a noun, the noun does not have plural marking. So if whether you say 1 duck or 2 duck, it sounds exactly the same. And let me show you how we taught babies quantity labels. So this is an example of a training trial. So babies would see these kinds of trial with different objects repeated several times, and after that we would proceed to the generalization test. So we would show completely new objects that they haven't seen during training, and we would ask them this. So we would simply ask them to look one of the two sets, and they did. So they successfully increased their looking to the named set at test, and and you can see. So basically, this is the composite score. It's above 0, so showing that they looked longer at the set that was labeled. And here you can see basically how this response evolved over time. And basically, the important bit here is that it's positive for quite a. It starts quite late, but then it remains on the remains positive. So basically, this effect was quite sustained. So great, babies can, at 1 year of age, they can learn labels for 1 and 2, which means that now we can test for compositionality. And in order to test for compositionality, we have to top up our game a little bit. So 2 reference won't be enough. We need to show babies more things to look at, because we want to make sure that they process the 2 words and that they combine their meanings. Alternatively, what they could be doing, they could be just focusing on one of the 2 words that they hear, for example, number. So in that case, they would look longer at all, if they hear the word 2, they would look longer at both sets that contain 2 objects. Or maybe on the contrary, they would decide in this complex visual scene that they don't care about numbers, these new words at all, and they would only look at they would only focus on the kind label, in which case they would look longer at all sets that contain DAGs. And just let me show you how this looked like. And what we saw is even if this very complex visual display, babies were able to find the referent of the target set. So they increased their looking after naming only to the set that was to the set that was the combination of the 2 words, and again. This effect took a while to emerge, so it took them time to process these 2 words together, but then it was quite sustained for a few seconds. And in the last experiment, we were sort of curious what's the mechanism underlying this early composition. Are the babies sequentially searching for 2 and then for the word 2, for the referent of word 2 and for the referent of word DAG? Or maybe they're doing some sort of conjunction of the 2, or maybe they are actually combining them and doing something like we do when we count, when we quantify. So they retrieve one concept and they apply the other one to it. And in order to answer this, we sort of modified our test display where we included a mixed structure. And we reasoned that if babies just sample one of the concepts, they should look equally to these 2 reference. But if they apply one concept to the other, they do something like a proto-primitive quantification, they should look longer selectively only to the unified set of 2 DAGs. And this is what we found. So basically, you can see the results of experiment mirror perfectly the results of experiment 2. Babies were unperturbed by this new structure, and they selectively increased their looking to the homogeneous sets of 2 DAGs, suggesting that they composed the 2 words in quite a sophisticated way. Great. So this basically brings me to my conclusions, and sorry for running over time. So I hope that I convinced you that babies can deploy conceptual representations and can use them for quite sophisticated things, including compositionality. I'm not going to talk about the nonverbal aspects of it, but we have ongoing studies looking at whether compositionality can happen outside of natural language. Just hit me up and I'll tell you about that. And basically, what I hope I have convinced you that this first possibility that I have listed at the beginning may be the case, and even if you're not completely sold of it, at least you can take this research as sort of a springboard for further questions, looking into this early symbolic and compositional abilities that we can observe at the end of the first year of life, long before the emergence of speech, that is productive language, and long before formal education. And why would babies have access to these sorts of mechanisms? Well, they can't do much, they cannot produce or create more. But I think that this could be an adaptation to compress information and build abstract models of the world that will allow them for very fast and generalizable learning, which we know they are capable of, but we don't fully understand how they do that. So that's all I've had for today. Thanks so much for your attention. And thank you to the two sets of people in Birmingham and also at CEU, where most of this work was done, for supporting me throughout the journey. Thanks.